Nobody saw this coming. Congress was expecting another routine debate, but what unfolded shook the entire room. Pam Bondi, known for her sharp legal mind and fearless approach, had just exposed Adam Schiff in a way no one could ignore. It happened in real time. No scripts, no pre-approved statements, just raw, undeniable facts. Schiff had walked into that hearing confident, composed, and ready to push his narrative. But within minutes, his entire argument crumbled. And it wasn't just the Republicans who noticed. Even some of Schiff's own colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that Bondi had just delivered one of the most devastating takedowns in congressional history. The clip? It spread like wildfire, racking up millions of views in hours, forcing even liberal media outlets to scramble for damage control. So what exactly happened in that shocking exchange? And how did Pam Bondi leave Adam Schiff speechless on the Senate floor? Let's break it down. The air inside the congressional chamber was thick with anticipation. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle sat rigid in their seats, their eyes locked on the two central figures, Pam Bondi and Adam Schiff. It was supposed to be just another political debate, another opportunity for Schiff to push his narrative, to paint himself as the voice of reason, while accusing his opponents of misinformation. As the cameras rolled, Schiff adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and launched into a speech that sounded well-rehearsed, one that had been carefully crafted to frame his party as the defenders of democracy and accountability. "We must ensure that government officials are held to the highest standard," Schiff declared, his voice carrying through the chamber. "Transparency is not a partisan issue. It is a necessity for the integrity of this institution." Several of his colleagues nodded in agreement, their expressions stoic as if they had already decided the outcome of this debate. Pam Bondi? She sat silent and composed, listening carefully, not showing the slightest hint of reaction. She had heard it all before, the polished rhetoric, the selective outrage, the grandstanding, but this time she wasn't going to let it slide. Schiff, sensing that the floor was his, leaned in confidently, pressing further. He accused conservative leaders of spreading misinformation, of twisting facts to mislead the American people. "We cannot allow bad actors to manipulate public perception," Schiff said, his tone firm. "The American people deserve the truth, and it is our responsibility to uphold it." That was it. That was the moment. Pam Bondi tilted her head slightly, a knowing smile forming at the corner of her lips. She had let him talk long enough. The entire room could feel the shift, the calm before the storm, and nobody was ready for what came next. Adam Schiff leaned back slightly, satisfied with his performance. He had laid the foundation, carefully crafting an argument that painted himself as the defender of truth, while subtly implying that his opponents, Pam Bondi included, were the real problem. But that's when everything changed. Pam Bondi, who had remained silent throughout Schiff's monologue, finally leaned forward, resting her hands on the table in front of her. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet certainty that sent a ripple through the chamber. "Congressman Schiff," she said, her voice even controlled, "I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You're saying that the American people deserve transparency, that there should be no selective application of justice, that every leader, regardless of party, should be held to the same standard. Is that right?" Schiff nodded quickly, eager to claim the moral high ground. "Absolutely," he replied. "That is the foundation of democracy." Pam let a small pause hang in the air, and then perhaps you can explain why, when faced with clear evidence of wrongdoing within your own party, you turned a blind eye. The tension in the room was palpable. Some lawmakers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, suddenly far more interested in the exchange than they had been a moment ago. Schiff blinked, his carefully rehearsed expression momentarily faltering. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said quickly, his voice carrying a defensive edge. Pam Bondi tilted her head, her lips pressing into a thin smile. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I'm referring to," she said, her tone sharp but controlled. The room grew even quieter. Pam wasn't done. She picked up a stack of documents and flipped through them deliberately, letting the weight of the moment sink in. "You've made it clear today that you believe in holding leaders accountable," she continued. "So tell me, Congressman, why does that standard seem to change depending on who is being investigated?" Schiff opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Pam turned over the first page and began reading aloud. And just like that, Schiff's own words were about to be used against him. The room was so quiet that the sound of Pam Bondi flipping the page of her documents seemed to echo through the chamber. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she took her time, a deliberate move that only made Schiff more uneasy. Adam Schiff adjusted his tie, shifting slightly in his seat. His earlier confidence had started to fade, replaced by the slightest flicker of unease. Pam Bondi finally looked up from the papers, her expression still unreadable. Then, with absolute composure, she began to read aloud. On multiple occasions, Congressman Schiff, you have stated, and I quote, "No one is above the law. The American people deserve full transparency, no matter who is involved." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Schiff nodded stiffly, clearly unsure of where this was going. Pam continued, "And yet, when questioned about the credibility of the sources behind your most publicized investigations, you repeatedly dismissed concerns, refused to release key transcripts, and, on more than one occasion, misled the public about the evidence you claimed to have." A murmur spread through the chamber. Some lawmakers exchanged glances, realizing that Schiff had just walked into a trap. Schiff's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together on the table as if trying to regain control. "That's a mischaracterization," he interjected quickly. "My statements were based on the information available at the time." Pam Bondi didn't even blink. "That's interesting," she said smoothly, flipping to another page. "Because here's another statement of yours. November 2019, you looked the American people in the eye and said," she glanced up at him, "I have seen clear evidence. I have proof." Another wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Schiff opened his mouth, but Pam kept going. "You claimed over and over again that the evidence was undeniable, but when pressed to produce it, suddenly the story changed. Suddenly, transparency wasn't so important anymore." She leaned back slightly, crossing her hands over the documents. "Congressman Schiff, I have one simple question for you." The room went silent. Schiff said nothing. Pam tilted her head slightly, her tone sharper now. "If no one is above the law, why did you refuse to be held to the same standard?" The air in the chamber felt heavier. For the first time, Schiff didn't have a response ready. His lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers tightening around his pen. Pam Bondi wasn't done. She let the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then she delivered the final setup. "Because from where I'm sitting, Congressman, it seems like the rules only apply when they're convenient for you." The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. Schiff's face remained expressionless, but the subtle twitch in his jaw said everything. Pam hadn't even raised her voice, but she had already won, and the real takedown was still coming. Adam Schiff sat rigid in his chair, his grip on his pen tightening. He knew he needed to regain control to shift the narrative before it was too late. He cleared his throat, his voice measured but strained. "Ms. Bondi, I appreciate your concerns, but these matters were thoroughly investigated. If we're discussing transparency, then I assume you also believe that all officials, regardless of party, should be held accountable for their actions." Pam Bondi smiled faintly, tilting her head ever so slightly. "Absolutely, that's why I'm here today." She flipped another page in her stack of documents, barely glancing at it before returning her gaze to Schiff. "So let's talk about accountability." The room stilled. "You claim to stand for transparency, yet when you were directly asked to release the full transcripts of closed-door testimonies that contradicted your public claims, you refused." Schiff shifted uncomfortably, but Pam didn't stop. "You sat on exculpatory evidence. You knew it didn't support your narrative, so you buried it. And when asked why, you brushed it off as protecting national security." She let out a sharp breath, not out of frustration, but as if she almost couldn't believe she had to spell this out for him. "Congressman, national security isn't a scapegoat for misleading the American people, and yet, over and over again, you've weaponized it whenever the facts didn't fit your agenda." A few lawmakers exchanged nervous glances. Schiff's fingers drummed against the table. "I reject that characterization. The information I shared was based on—" "Based on what, Congressman?" Pam interrupted, her voice never rising but her words cutting like a blade. "Hearsay? Speculation? Anonymous sources that couldn't even be verified?" Schiff froze. The chamber was dead silent. Pam leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now, but somehow even more dangerous. You didn't seek the truth, you shaped a narrative. And when that narrative started to crumble, you deflected. You obstructed. And now, you sit here and lecture the rest of us on accountability? Schiff's jaw tightened, but he had no response. Pam Bondi wasn't finished. Tell me, Congressman, what exactly was your definition of evidence when you went on national television and told the American people that you had proof? The room held its breath. Schiff's lips parted slightly, a flicker of hesitation. Pam delivered the final blow. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the only thing you had was a microphone and a willingness to mislead. Boom. The entire chamber erupted into murmurs. Even some of Schiff's colleagues looked away, suddenly very interested in their notes. Schiff's face was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw said everything. Pam leaned back in her chair, perfectly composed. She didn't need to say another word. The damage? Already done. For a moment, absolute silence filled the congressional chamber. Pam Bondi had just dropped a political bombshell, and everyone knew it. Adam Schiff stared blankly, his usual confidence completely drained. The once polished congressman, who had spent years crafting narratives, controlling the media spin and dictating the conversation, now sat exposed, cornered by his own words. The camera zoomed in, capturing every flicker of discomfort. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted to the side, his mouth opened slightly as if to respond, but then he hesitated. For the first time, Adam Schiff looked uncertain. The damage was already done. A murmur of voices rippled through the room. Some lawmakers whispered among themselves, exchanging knowing glances. Others sat frozen, watching Schiff with unreadable expressions. Even the reporters, who had arrived expecting another predictable political back and forth, were suddenly scrambling to capture this moment. This wasn't just a tough question, this was a complete unraveling. Pam Bondi didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't celebrate. She simply folded her hands in front of her, her expression steady and unreadable, letting the silence stretch. The tension was unbearable. Schiff cleared his throat, grasping for control. Pam tilted her head slightly, waiting. Schiff's voice failed him. The words weren't coming. A soft cough came from the back of the room. Someone shuffled their papers. A few seats creaked as lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. Schiff finally reached for his water glass, taking a long sip. But even that wasn't enough to steady him. Pam Bondi finally spoke, her voice as calm as ever. Congressman Schiff, you built an entire case on half-truths and selective outrage. And now, when asked to answer for it, you have nothing to say. The murmurs grew louder. A few reporters exchanged glances, their fingers flying over their keyboards, knowing they had just witnessed something historic. Schiff glanced toward his staffers, his eyes pleading for some kind of escape. But they sat wide-eyed, completely unsure how to salvage the moment. The silence felt like an eternity. Pam gathered her papers, adjusting them neatly, as if this had just been another routine discussion. Then, as if sensing the weight of the moment, she leaned slightly forward, locking eyes with Schiff one last time. Perhaps the American people deserve better than empty words and deflections. Perhaps next time they'll remember who stood for the truth and who hid behind a microphone. She let the words hang in the air, making sure everyone in that chamber felt the gravity of what had just happened. And then she sat back, completely composed. The room erupted. Some lawmakers nodded in silent approval, their expressions grim but satisfied. Others whispered furiously, knowing exactly what had just happened. The reporters? They had their headline. The internet was about to explode. And Adam Schiff? For the first time in his career, he had no comeback. The hearing had barely concluded when the internet erupted. Pam Bondi had just delivered one of the most brutal congressional takedowns in years, and within minutes, the clip was everywhere. News networks rushed to air the footage, but they weren't fast enough. Social media had already beaten them to it. The 45-second clip of Schiff sitting in stunned silence after Bondi's final remarks was instantly turned into a viral sensation. People couldn't stop replaying it. It was the kind of moment that couldn't be ignored, the kind of moment that transcends politics and turns into pure internet gold. Trending hashtags flooded social media. Hashtag Pam Bondi exposes Schiff. Hashtag Congress Showdown. Hashtag Truth Hurts. Hashtag Schiff silenced. The video spread like wildfire, racking up millions of views within hours as people from across the political spectrum watched the moment again and again. The comments were ruthless. This wasn't a debate, it was a masterclass in accountability. Schiff just got fact-checked live on air and had nothing to say. Pam Bondi just ended Schiff's career in real time. Even conservative commentators couldn't stop talking about it. Fox News immediately ran the headline, "Pam Bondi destroys Adam Schiff in congressional hearing, the internet erupts." The Daily Wire posted, "Watch, Schiff left speechless after Pam Bondi calls him out." Meanwhile, left-leaning outlets scrambled to spin the story. CNN called it a contentious exchange and suggested that Bondi had taken Schiff's words out of context. MSNBC claimed that Schiff was simply being strategic with his response. But none of it mattered because the raw footage didn't lie, and the internet wasn't buying the excuses. Even some Democrats began subtly distancing themselves from Schiff, realizing the PR disaster unfolding in real time. But what truly pushed the moment into internet history was when the meme pages got involved. Within hours, Schiff's stunned face was photoshopped into every possible situation. When you realize your entire argument just collapsed, when the teacher asks you to show your work and you were guessing the whole time, that moment when Pam Bondi receipts checks your entire career. Schiff's office was in full damage control mode by mid-afternoon. His team released a vague statement claiming that the hearing was highly politicized and that his remarks were taken out of context. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The clip was everywhere. Twitter threads, Instagram reels, Facebook posts. Every platform was flooded with people sharing, analyzing, and breaking down every second of the exchange. The clip was even turned into remixes and parody videos, edited alongside dramatic sound effects, slow-motion reactions, and even fake boxing match-style commentary. And then, Pam Bondi made her final move. She didn't need to give a press conference. She didn't need to issue a long response. She simply retweeted the clip with one single caption. "Your move." That was it. And just like that, the clip exploded even further. It wasn't just viral. It was now historic. By the end of the night, the video had over 20 million views. By the end of the week, it was officially one of the most watched congressional moments in recent history. And Schiff, his name was now forever tied to one of the worst political embarrassments of his career. The moment had passed, but the impact was far from over. Pam Bondi didn't just call out Adam Schiff, she exposed something much bigger than a single debate or political hearing. This wasn't just about one exchange. This wasn't just about one bad moment for Schiff. This was about a system built on selective accountability, where the rules only seemed to apply when they were convenient, when they benefited the right people, and punished the wrong ones. For years, Adam Schiff had positioned himself as the defender of truth, the voice of integrity, the man who stood against corruption. He had built a public image on being the one who held others accountable. But when confronted with his own contradictions, his own history of bending facts, his own record of manipulating narratives to fit his agenda, he had nothing left to say. The fallout was immediate. The silence, the hesitation, the complete inability to respond in that moment. It spoke louder than any press release ever could. This wasn't just a bad debate performance. This wasn't just a difficult question he fumbled through. It was a reckoning. Millions of Americans watched as a once powerful political figure crumbled under the weight of his own words. Some called it justice, a long overdue moment of accountability, a turning point in exposing political hypocrisy. Others scrambled to defend him, claiming the moment was being taken out of context, that he had simply misspoken, that this was nothing more than another political stunt blown out of proportion. But at the end of the day, the truth didn't need spin. It didn't need excuses. It didn't need a headline crafted to soften the blow. It was there, plain as day, undeniable, for the entire world to see. Pam Bondi had done something that few in Washington dared to do. She didn't just challenge the narrative. She tore it apart, piece by piece, leaving nothing for Schiff to hide behind. The media scrambled to shift the conversation, desperate to downplay what had just happened. Networks rushed to change the subject, trying to frame the moment as just another political clash. But it wasn't. No spin, no damage control, no desperate explanations could change the fact that people had seen it for themselves. They had watched a politician who had spent years lecturing others about accountability completely unravel when faced with his own standard. This moment wasn't something Schiff could talk his way out of. There was no carefully crafted statement, no friendly media outlet that could undo what had just happened. His silence, his hesitation, his refusal to answer the simplest of questions told the world everything it needed to know. The game had changed, and for once the people controlling the narrative weren't the ones behind the podiums or the television cameras. This wasn't just a political moment, it was a warning. Because when the truth is finally exposed, when the curtain is pulled back, when the double standards are laid bare for the public to see, there's no spinning your way out of it, there's no talking around it, there's no rewriting the script. The only question left is, how many more politicians will be held to this same standard? And perhaps more importantly, who's next?